Thanks a lot. Hello. My name's Yuraima Estevez. I am a senior software engineer at the New York Times, coming over from New York. I am technically on Twitter as of this year, so new to Twitter, at Yurm04. Sometimes I tweet about code stuff that I like accessibility and open source. Most of the times, though, I retweet cute dog GIFs, so there's definitely something on there for everyone. I've been coding for about 7 years now, and about 5 of those I've somehow made a living out of it. I started off in college, actually, in 2012, but I was not a typical computer science major because I actually went through most of college studying to be some kind of scientist. Biology, chemistry, physics, all the fun stuff, that's what I was studying. But my senior year, my last year in college, I decided that that wasn't the right path for me. So instead, I took up a few computer science classes, and I immediately fell in love. And that love for programming has really opened up a world of opportunities for me. And I truly believe that it's thanks to the code that I've learned, I've written, I've reviewed, sometimes I hated, honestly, but mostly I truly loved. So today, I want to share some letters I've written to all the code I've loved before. I'm going to start off with a letter to what I think is probably a dear old friend for many of us here. Dear PHP. Yeah. After about 2 semesters of computer science classes, I knew I wanted to become a programmer, but I absolutely did not have the skills I needed to even come close to getting a job out in the real world. So I did what anyone else would do in my situation. I turned to Google. I searched for any and all resources that I could find on the internet. And a huge majority of what I found pointed me straight to PHP. Now, I'm not sure what the stats were back then in 2012, 2013, but even today, almost 80% of websites in existence are powered by PHP. And that is a number I found somewhere on the internet, probably on a site that is built with PHP. So it made sense that I found all of these free PHP resources and I could just jump right in. And I absolutely did jump right in. I read all of the articles, I watched all of the videos, and I built all of the practice sites because PHP made it really easy for me to get started and learn all the things that I thought developers should know. It forced me to figure out how to work with servers and databases. I had to consider performance and security, and it allowed me to learn across the stack from front through to the back. But as great as it was to pick up PHP so easily, I also started to lean on it a little too heavily. It was really easy for me to reach for the thing that I knew best to solve all of my problems. And as the saying goes, when all you have is a hammer, everything around you starts to look like a nail. The perfect example of this is the time when I was given a code test as part of an interview for a 3D printer company. The test was to take a bunch of 3D modeling files and parse them out into a specific format. At this point, I was still within my first year out of college. I had probably applied to dozens and dozens of junior developer jobs. I was really just trying to get my foot in the door. I managed to get a couple of phone interviews, but I never really was able to drum up any interest beyond that point. And finally, this company decided to advance me to the next stage of the interview process. So I really wanted to do a good job on this code test. So I grabbed my trusty PHP hammer, and I nailed my solution. Okay, I got like 5 laughs. I'm proud of that one. I'm proud of that one. No, but the solution was actually pretty awful. Technically, it worked, but it was hacky, and it was ugly, and it had no business ever seeing the light of day. And I think that's one of the reasons that PHP has such a bad reputation. Because imagine all of the times you used a language or a framework or some tool that you were comfortable with. You knew it front and back, and you reached for it, even though you knew it wasn't right for the job. Now imagine that scenario and scale it to 80% of the internet. Eventually, developers are going to start to conflate poorly written code with the language the code it's written in. That, and if you forget the semicolon at the end of a PHP statement, your entire program melts down. But learning PHP was one of the first times I felt like I was really starting to figure out this whole developer thing. It's what helped me land my first proper web developer jobs, not at the 3D printer company, definitely not there. So I don't know where I would be now if it weren't for PHP. And that's why it's always going to have a special place in my heart. Now, as I said, my experience with PHP was one of the first times I felt like I was actually starting to figure out what it meant to be a developer. There were servers to spin up, databases to query, but one of the most crucial things I learned fairly early on that was absolutely essential to every developer's workflow is version control. Dear Git. I had no idea what Git was until well into my developer journey. My GitHub history doesn't start, I think my first contribution was in 2014, and remember I started coding in 2012, so there are 2 years where I was coding, and I don't know what was happening after that in between those years. But I did at some point figure it out. And when I first started with Git, it was one of the scariest things that I'd ever had to work with. I think a lot of that fear came from having to type out all of those commands in the terminal. I had taken a Unix programming class in college, so I knew some of the basics of the terminal, but ever since my professor put the fear of rm-rf/star in me, and made me think that I could accidentally wipe out my entire computer with just one command, I could not look at the terminal the same ever again. And of course, there was the added layer of not having any idea how this magical program worked, or ever really knowing what I was doing, even after I'd figure out what commands to enter and in what sequence. Merge conflicts. Yeah. Merge conflicts were so traumatic for me that I would sooner bail out than risk all of my work being lost by trying to resolve them. Whenever I'd find myself in some kind of a Git bind, I could just turn to my trusty git checkout command and wipe the slate clean, start over. Again, when all you have is a hammer, ... You know the rest. But luckily, like pretty much everything else in programming, the longer I kept at it and the more merge conflicts I survived, the easier it got. And eventually, I actually started to think that Git was pretty cool. Or rather, I started to feel pretty cool now that I kind of knew what I was doing. Because here was this dev tool that I thought I would never understand, which for me at the time meant that I would never be a good developer. But as soon as I got the hang of it, I felt almost like I could do anything. Like I could hack into the mainframe. Or like I was finally understanding all of the code in the matrix around me. And that was a huge deal for me. I went from not knowing that something like Git even existed to not knowing what I would do every day without it. Now, speaking of things we don't know what we'd do without, dear JavaScript. JavaScript was going through a super awkward phase when I started learning it. It was still this quirky, weird language that other developers like to make fun of, but it was also starting to gain a bit of popularity as Node was coming onto the scene. HTML and CSS were some of the first languages I learned and actually enjoyed using, so naturally I gravitated towards the front end and naturally gravitated towards JavaScript. I loved it because it transformed the little I knew about building websites, and it helped me bring them to life fairly easily. But yeah, it definitely earned its reputation as the quirky one. For example, JavaScript seemingly had two modes. One mode where things worked in ways that you didn't expect or understand sometimes. Here, I forgot my variable declaration, so my name gets created in the global scope and added to the window object, and seemingly works just fine. And then there's another mode where things just broke in ways that you didn't expect or understand sometimes. Now that I have us in strict mode, forgetting this variable declaration throws a reference error, because my variable did not exist when we tried assigning a value to it. And again, this is seemingly by design. But even with all of its quirks, JavaScript has come a long way since my earlier days, and I think I've grown right alongside it. I very honestly consider myself lucky to have gotten into it when I did, because I had a chance to learn at the pace that it was still evolving. And yet, even though I consider myself a pretty strong JavaScript engineer so many years later, there are still some weird things about it that I continue to uncover. And I don't even mean these tricky, unexpected one-liners that we see floating around the internet from time to time to give us a good laugh. I'm talking about foundational concepts, things I thought I had mastered a long time ago, but suddenly it turns out that I had no idea what I was doing. I'm talking about hoisting. Just last year, 2018, was the first time I actually, finally, for real, learned what hoisting in JavaScript means. And it is not, as I had believed for so many years, the act of JavaScript physically lifting variables up from further down in your file and plopping them on the top so that you didn't have to worry about when you were referencing them in your code. It's actually a concept that we cooked up to try and explain how execution context works in specific phases of JavaScript. There's a compiler, there are several phases, the word memory gets thrown around a bunch. It's a wild ride. So, 30-second explanation of what hoisting actually is. We see this statement here, and even though it's written in one line of code, it actually accomplishes two things at different stages. In the first phase, the compiler phase, we process our code and we declare a variable called myname. After we process our code, during the execution phase, that's when we assign a value to our variable. And that's why this bit of code can be visualized as if it were written like this bit of code, because it's easier to understand it as if it were a single sequence. We process or hoist our declaration first. Then we execute our code and log out the value of myname, which at this point is undefined. And lastly, we assign our value to the variable. This was big. This was a big deal for me. I had to grapple with this for a few days. Obviously, this is a huge oversimplification of hoisting. I only had like 30 seconds to explain it, but it absolutely blew my mind that I had misunderstood this fundamental concept in JavaScript for so long, even though 7-ish years later, I try to convince people that I'm pretty good at JavaScript. And I'm sure there are plenty of us here today that have similar stories like this because, you know, JavaScript's the quirky one. Despite its weird quirks, though, and its strangely overcomplicated explanations of even more difficult topics, JavaScript is my favorite language. Who'd have thought I'd make a career out of a language that a lot of people refuse to take seriously for so long? And that language would go on to be used not just in the browser, but on the server side, in CLI tools, IoT, mobile apps, machine learning, the list goes on. I sure didn't. Thank you. I'm proud of that one, too. And I think a lot of that disbelief has to do with some difficult realities I've had to come to terms with as of late. I mentioned earlier that a lot of developers liked to poke fun at JavaScript. Back when I was starting out, I'd hear things like, oh, JavaScript isn't a real language. It's just a scripting language on the front end. And when I'd talk about working on the front end, I'd get similar reactions about HTML and CSS. HTML is just a markup language. Or CSS isn't programming, it's just for style sheets. And even when I try to prove myself by making the case that I'd worked in other languages and I knew other tech, the outcome was usually the same. Python's just for beginners. Talk to me when you get into the hard stuff. Or no one uses C++ anymore. That's just something they teach you in Computer Science 101. Now, these are all statements that I can now, after many, many years, point to and identify as forms of gatekeeping. They're ways to make me feel like an other, to try and keep me out of some elite club that I'd never be invited to. But back then, even though the words I was hearing were, "That's not a real programming language," the sentiment behind it landed a lot closer to, "You're not a real programmer." And that's why this next love letter is a little bit different from the others. Dear newcomers, I really wish someone had said this to me when I was first starting out, especially when I was feeling cut down, mostly by folks that all looked a lot like each other, but none of whom ever really looked like me. So in case anyone here needs it today, I want to make sure I'm the one to say it. If you're a student trying to get through a really hard computer science class, or you're a career changer in the middle of a boot camp intensive, maybe you just landed your first job and you're feeling overwhelmed, even if you wrote your very first hello world this morning, congratulations. You're a programmer, or a developer, or an engineer, however you want to identify. Because the only thing that separates programmers from non-programmers is that you tried, and that you keep trying, because we're really all just trying to figure out as we code. And that's the last of my love letters, but there's so much more code that I didn't get to share today. There are my early days in C++, probably the very first language I learned, and definitely the very first language I was really, really bad at. And I think that's because I could never figure out how pointers worked, ? And there's my Go code. I picked it up for work just a few months ago, and I also can't figure out how pointers work there. So I'm convinced pointers are just hard. There's the code that's gotten me into some serious trouble, like that seemingly harmless database query I wrote that I thought was so not a big deal. All I wanted to do was update the host and my local development environment. Super simple. Until I realized that I ran it on a production database, and then I had to enter full panic mode to try and get everything back. I did get it back, but I was quietly panicking the whole time. And then there's the code that makes me feel like I'm part of something bigger than just myself. It's the code that allows me to mentor, to teach, and contribute to open source. And most importantly, there's the code that allows me to be here today, that's given me the opportunity and the pleasure to be part of this amazing community. And it empowers me to come up on stage and share my story. And for that, I will always be grateful to the code I've written. Every last line. Thank you.